My name is Layla Marsh, and I was 24 years old when I married a man who smiled at me like I was the only person in a room full of people, and I mistook that for love. It took me 4 years to understand the difference between a man who looks at you like you are everything and a man who looks at you like you are useful. The look is identical from the inside. You can only tell them apart once the useful part runs out. I want to tell you about the 201st, because that is where the story ends before it begins again, and endings that look like nothing are sometimes the only honest place to start. The morning I finally looked at our joint account really looked the way I had stopped letting myself look for years, because looking meant knowing and knowing meant deciding. The balance was 214.37. Not a rounding error. Not a slow month. 4 years of a shared life reduced to 214.37 and a transaction history that told a story I had been too busy surviving to read. I had a daughter. I had no job. I had a joint account with 214.37 in it and a husband who was, at that exact moment, sitting across town in the apartment of a woman I had never met but whose name I had known for 6 weeks, carrying it quietly the way you carry something heavy when you have not yet decided where to put it down. Welcome to Signed in Silence, where we tell stories about women who were left with nothing and built everything from it. If you have ever stood at the bottom of something and looked up and thought, I do not know how to begin, stay with me. Because Layla Marsh began with 214.37 and a daughter who needed breakfast, and that was enough. I met James at 23, which is old enough to know better and young enough to believe you do anyway. He was 29, which felt like maturity at the time and which I understand now was simply age, because maturity and age share a birthday but do not always grow up together. He worked in sales, which means he was professionally good at making people feel chosen, and he had refined that skill to the point where it worked on everyone, his clients, his colleagues, his friends, and me, especially me, because I was 23 and had grown up in a house where being chosen was not something that happened quietly and steadily but something that was given and withheld in turns, and I was hungry for the steady version. We dated for 8 months. He proposed on a Tuesday, which I found romantic at the time because I thought it meant he could not wait for a more obvious occasion, and which I understand now meant he had not planned very far ahead. We got married in the spring, a small ceremony at a garden venue with string lights and a borrowed dress, and his whole family in the front rows and my mother in the third row looking proud in a way she had never quite managed before, which should have told me something about who this marriage was for. It told me nothing. I was 24 and in the string lights, and I believed in the look he gave me across the ceremony, the one that said you are everything. The first year of marriage is the year you discover the shape of another person's dailiness. James's dailiness was good in the ways that register immediately and complicated in the ways that take longer to name. He was warm and funny and social in the way of people who are never quite comfortable being alone, which means he was always planning the next thing, the next dinner, the next weekend trip, the next group of friends descending on our apartment with wine and noise that I sometimes loved and sometimes found exhausting and never felt entirely comfortable saying so because his happiness was so visible and I did not want to be the person who dimmed it. He was also, I noticed quietly and filed away without examining, someone who answered his phone in another room. Not always. Not so consistently that I could point to it and say something. Just often enough that I noticed and not often enough that I acted. That is the geography of early suspicion in a marriage. Too much to ignore, too little to confront, and the space in between is where you learn to live with a low-grade wrongness you do not yet have language for. We had our daughter, Mia, in our second year. She arrived in February, small and certain, with James's eyes and my stubbornness, and the particular clarity that a new person brings into a room settled over me like a change in weather. I left my job in marketing, which had been building toward something and which I had liked, because James's salary covered us and Mia needed someone and the calculus seemed simple at the time. I would go back when Mia was older. I would return to the building thing when there was more space and more time and when the ground felt more settled beneath me. The ground did not settle. It shifted, slowly, the way ground shifts when something underneath it is moving, and I kept adjusting my footing and telling myself it was normal, and the adjustments got smaller and more automatic until adjusting was all I did, all day, without noticing I was doing it. James started working late in Mia's first year. Not every night. Not even most nights. But the late nights had a texture to them that the early nights did not, a quality of his return that was too casual, too deliberately unbothered, the kind of ease that a person performs when they have been practicing it in the car on the way home. I noticed the texture. I did not name it. Mia was 8 months old and I was operating on interrupted sleep and the work of keeping a small person alive, and there was no room in me for anything that required sustained attention. I want to be honest about the next 2 years because the honest version is the only one that is useful. I knew, in the way that you know things you have decided not to examine, that something in my marriage was not right. I knew it in the texture of James's late nights and in the way his phone was always face down on the table and in the way he laughed too easily at things that were not funny when he was on it and in the way he was sometimes kind to me with a particular warmth that felt like guilt wearing love's clothes. I knew and I did not know, which is not a contradiction. It is the exact state of a woman with a small child and no income and a marriage she cannot afford, emotionally or practically, to look at directly. So I did not look directly. I looked sideways, the way you look at something bright when you do not have sunglasses. I asked careful questions. I mentioned things. I watched his face when I mentioned things. None of it was enough to cross the line from knowing to knowing, and I think now that I drew the line there deliberately, just far enough that I could stay on the safe side of it and keep the life I had assembled around my daughter intact. The thing that moved the line was a Saturday afternoon in October, Mia's 3rd year, when James said he was going to help his friend Marcus move some furniture and would be back by 6. I had heard Marcus before. Marcus was the friend James invoked the way people invoke utility players, useful in specific situations, rarely examined too closely. I had met Marcus once at a party and he had been pleasant and unremarkable and I had no reason to think about him much. Except that on that Saturday afternoon Mia spilled an entire cup of juice on herself and then on me and then on the couch, with the comprehensive commitment only a 3-year-old can bring to a spill, and in the middle of cleaning it up I realized I needed to call James to pick up more juice on his way home because we were out and Mia would not drink anything else and his number went to voicemail and I texted and then I called again and it went to voicemail again and I thought nothing of it. Put the phone down, finished cleaning the couch. At 6:30 he was not home. At 7 I called again and he answered, slightly out of breath, and said he was on his way. He brought no juice. When I mentioned it he said he had forgotten, which was ordinary enough, but there was something in his voice that had the quality of a man who has just returned from somewhere he has constructed a story about, and I recognized the quality because I had been cataloguing it for 2 years without naming it, and that evening, after Mia was in bed, I sat in the kitchen and I finally named it. I did not confront him that night. I am a person who needs to be sure before I speak, which has cost me time in my life and saved me from mistakes in equal measure, and I was not yet sure in the way that makes speaking useful. I was only sure in the way that makes looking necessary. I started with the phone records, which I accessed through our shared family plan account, a login I had set up and James had never asked about because James did not manage the accounts. I did. I went back 3 months. Then 6. I looked for patterns the way you look for patterns when you have a project manager's instinct for data, which I had developed in the job I had left and which had not left me. There was a number. It appeared with a regularity that made the rest of the record look sparse by comparison. Evenings, late. Sunday afternoons. Occasional mornings when James left early and said he needed to beat traffic. The calls were long, 15 minutes, 20, once 43 minutes on a Wednesday night when he had told me he was finishing a report at the office. The number was local. I ran a search on it the way I had learned to run searches when I worked in research and the name that came back was Priya Anand, 27, an address on the east side of the city. I sat with that name for 3 days. 3 days of ordinary life, Mia's breakfast and James's coffee and the school run and the grocery shopping and the evenings on the couch with the television on, and underneath all of it, Priya Anand's name sitting in me like a stone I had swallowed. On the 4th day I hired a private investigator. Her name was Carol Vance and she was recommended by a woman I knew from Mia's playgroup who had been through her own version of this and who handed me Carol's card with the quiet solidarity of someone passing a torch. Carol was businesslike and unsentimental and she told me what she needed and what she could deliver and what it would cost and I said yes to all of it because the cost of not knowing had already been 4 years of my life and I was done paying it. Carol delivered her report 2 weeks later. I read it in my car in the parking lot of Mia's preschool while Mia was inside doing finger painting, because I needed to be alone when I read it, and the car was the only alone I had. The report was thorough and factual and documented 18 months of a relationship that had its own rhythms and its own geography and its own comfortable domesticity, the kind that takes time to build and which means someone has been building it while they were also building something else with you. 18 months. Mia had been 22 months old when it started. She had been learning to walk. I had been learning to live on interrupted sleep and the particular isolation of early motherhood, and I had been adjusting my footing every day and telling myself it was normal. I sat in the car for 12 minutes after I finished reading. Then I picked Mia up from finger painting and took her home and made her lunch and put her down for her nap and sat at the kitchen table with Carol's report in front of me and did what I do when I need to think clearly. I opened a document. I started a list. I was not ready to decide what to do with what I knew. But I was ready to know it completely, which is a different thing, and the first step toward the second. The joint account was the next thing I looked at, and the joint account is where the story turned from painful to something else entirely, something that required a different kind of attention. I logged in on a Tuesday morning while Mia napped, and I went back as far as the records went, and I read the transaction history with the same methodical focus I had used on the phone records, and what I found was not dramatic in its individual entries but was devastating in its accumulation. James earned well. We had discussed this before we married, openly, because I had wanted transparency about money and he had offered it willingly, which I had taken as evidence of integrity and which I understand now was the offer of a man who knew how to present his finances selectively. His salary deposited into the joint account each month. My contributions came from a small amount of freelance work I had picked up when Mia was 2, not enough to call income, enough to feel less dependent. Together we should have been building something. The account balance should have been growing. It was not growing. It had not grown in 2 years. The balance hovered in the same range month after month, never building, never accumulating, because what came in was being matched by what went out, and what went out was ordinary expenses plus a set of transfers that I had never looked at closely because I had trusted the person making them. I went through every transfer for 24 months. I cross-referenced the amounts against our actual household expenses. I built a spreadsheet, column by column, date and amount and stated purpose and verified purpose. And the gap between the stated and the verified was not 47,000 like some stories. It was not a dramatic number. It was 1,340 a month, on average, transferred out of our joint account into an account I did not have access to and had never been told about, over 24 months. It was 32,160. It was the quiet, steady hemorrhage of a shared life being drained to fund a separate one. 32,160 in a joint account with 214.37 left in it, and a daughter who needed breakfast, and a woman sitting at a kitchen table who had spent 4 years adjusting her footing and had finally, on a Tuesday morning while her child napped, decided to stop adjusting and start building. I did not cry that morning. I had cried in the car in the preschool parking lot, and that had been the right place for it, private and contained. And now I was at the kitchen table with the spreadsheet, and I was done with the feeling part and ready for the other part. The part one was better at anyway. I called my friend Dina that afternoon. Dina had been my closest friend since college and had liked James in the beginning with the reservations she had expressed once and then set aside because I had asked her to, and she was that kind of friend. She was also a paralegal at a family law firm, which was the specific kind of friend I needed on a Tuesday afternoon with a spreadsheet on my screen and a private investigator's report in my bag. Dina came over that evening after Mia was in bed, and I spread everything on the kitchen table and told her all of it, from the phone records to Carol's report to the spreadsheet, in order, the way you tell a story when you want someone to understand the whole shape of it and not just the loudest part. Dina listened without interrupting, and when I finished she looked at the spreadsheet for a long time and then she looked at me. She said, "You need to see Margaret." Margaret Osei had been practicing family law for 16 years and had the quiet authority of someone who has heard every version of every story and is no longer surprised by any of them but has not stopped caring about the outcome. She saw me the following Monday in an office that smelled of good coffee and old books, and she read everything I brought without rushing and asked questions in the flat, precise way of someone building something with the answers. When she finished, she put the documents down and folded her hands and told me what I needed to know in the order I needed to know it. First, the marriage. Our state was an equitable distribution state, which meant marital assets were divided fairly rather than equally, with the court considering all relevant factors. The joint account transfers were a factor. 24 months of transfers from a marital account to fund a separate relationship was dissipation of marital assets, the intentional waste of shared money in a way that benefited one spouse at the expense of the other, and it was an actionable claim that affected the division. Second, my position. I had left my career to raise our daughter. That sacrifice was a factor too, what the law called a contribution to the marital estate that did not show up on a bank statement but was real and recognized. The court would consider it. Margaret would make sure the court considered it. Third, and this was the part that made me sit up straighter, the $32,160 did not disappear in a settlement. It was credited back to my share of the marital estate. Combined with my career sacrifice and the equitable distribution framework, my position was considerably stronger than 214.37 suggested. He was counting on you not looking, Margaret said. Yes, I said. And now you've looked. Yes, I said. She nodded and picked up her pen. Then let's begin. Margaret filed the petition on a Thursday. I did not tell James it was coming, and I did not warn him, and I did not feel guilty about not warning him because a person who had been quietly transferring $1,340 a month from our shared life to fund a separate one had been making decisions without me for 2 years, and I saw no reason to extend a courtesy he had not extended. He was served at his office, which Margaret had suggested for the same reasons it is always suggested, cleaner, more documented, witnessed. He called me 40 minutes later, and his voice was the voice of a man who has been moving through the world with the confidence of someone whose arrangements have remained undiscovered and who has just discovered they have not. He said he could explain. He said it was complicated. He said he still loved me and that things had gotten out of hand and that Priya meant nothing and that he wanted to come home and talk. I had heard some version of this speech in my head many times over the preceding weeks, and the actual version was smaller than the imagined one, less articulate, more frightened, and I felt briefly and unexpectedly sorry for him in the way you feel sorry for someone who has caused their own disaster and has not yet finished falling. The sorry lasted approximately 30 seconds. Then I told him to communicate through his attorney and ended the call. He came home anyway, that evening. He had a key and he used it, and I was in the kitchen and I stayed where I was. He walked in and he stood in the doorway of the kitchen and he looked at me with the version of himself he had decided to lead with, the remorseful version, the soft-eyed version, the version that had worked on me in various forms for 4 years and that I had loved and trusted and that I was looking at now with entirely different eyes. He talked for a long time. He said the things men say in kitchens when the thing they built in secret has been exposed and they are hoping the person they built the secret against is still more interested in keeping the peace than keeping the record. He said he was sorry. He said he had made mistakes. He said Mia needed her father. He said we could fix it. He said he would do anything. I let him finish. Then I picked up the folder from the counter where I had placed it specifically for this moment and I put it on the table between us. He looked at it. He looked at me. He opened it. I watched him read the spreadsheet and I watched him read the dates and I watched him recognize Carol's report and I watched the color leave his face in the particular way it leaves the face of a person who has been operating on the assumption of secrecy and has just discovered the assumption was wrong. He closed the folder. He said my name. I said, Margaret O'Say is my attorney. Her number is on the top sheet. Everything else is documented and everything documented is in her file. He left. I heard his car and then I did not hear it and I stood in the kitchen in the silence of a house that had been a particular kind of quiet for 4 years and was now a different kind, cleaner, mine. The negotiation took 5 months. James's attorney was competent and methodical and the process was not pleasant but it was not chaotic either, which is what documentation does for you. It removes chaos. It replaces it with dates and amounts and verified facts that do not change based on how either party feels about them on any given Tuesday, and the conversation stays, however painfully, in the realm of the provable. The dissipation claim was the center of it. James's attorney argued initially that the transfers had been for shared expenses that simply were not recorded, which the spreadsheet made impossible to sustain, because the spreadsheet cross-referenced every transfer against every actual shared expense and the gap was the gap and numbers do not renegotiate. The career sacrifice claim was the second pillar, Margaret presenting the income projection for the marketing career I had left, the 3 years of lost earnings and lost trajectory, the concrete cost of the choice I had made for our family while he was making different choices 12 minutes away. James offered, in the 3rd month, to pay child support at the statutory rate and split the remaining marital assets equally. Margaret countered with the dissipation credit, the career sacrifice consideration, and a child support figure based on his actual income rather than the minimum, supported by the bank records that showed what he actually earned and spent. The gap between his offer and hers was the gap between what he thought I would accept and what I was actually owed, and it took 2 more months for those two numbers to find each other in the middle. They found each other on a Wednesday morning in Margaret's conference room. I wore a grey jacket I had bought for the occasion because I wanted to be the version of myself that was composed and prepared rather than the version that was exhausted and grieving, and both versions were true and I chose one for the room. We signed the settlement agreement across a long table with Margaret beside me and James's attorney across from us and James himself at the far end, not quite looking at me, in the way of a person who is ashamed of the specific things rather than the general one. The settlement gave me the equitable share Margaret had built toward, including the dissipation credit for the $32,160, including the career sacrifice consideration, including a child support figure that reflected James's actual income. It was not a triumph in the way that word usually means. It was a fair accounting. It was the honest version of 4 years that had been conducted, on one side, dishonestly, and the fair accounting felt like something I had been waiting for without knowing I was waiting. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the north side of the city, in a building with a playground visible from the kitchen window, which mattered to me more than anything else about the apartment because Mia could see it from where she ate breakfast and the sight of it made her happy in the simple and complete way that things make small children happy, and her happiness was something I was going to spend a significant portion of the rest of my life building toward. I went back to work. Not to the same job, that position was long gone, but to the same field, to a project manager role at a mid-sized company that valued the skills I had not lost in 3 years of applying them to the management of a household and a child and a marriage that required more management than it should have. My manager told me in my first week that I had unusually good instincts for identifying where a project was at risk before the risk became a problem. I thanked her and did not explain where I had learned that. Mia is 4 now. She calls her father on Sundays, which is the arrangement, and she is too young to know the shape of what happened and old enough to feel the difference between a home that is steady and one that is not, and our home is steady in the way that homes are steady when the person running them is not dividing their attention between the life they have and the wrongness they are pretending not to see. I think about the 214.37 sometimes. Not with the feeling it carried that Tuesday morning, but with a different feeling, something closer to clarity. That number was the bottom. It was the place where 4 years of looking sideways ended and looking directly began. It was the morning I opened the account and read the history and built the spreadsheet and called Dina and called Margaret and chose, finally, the version of myself that was done adjusting and ready to build. The bottom is not the end. I know that now in my body the way you know things that have been tested. The bottom is the place where you find out what you are actually made of, stripped of the comfort of the life you thought you had, and what I found out, sitting at my kitchen table with 214.37 on the screen and a sleeping daughter in the next room, was that I was made of something that did not need a man's look to know its own value. Something that could read a spreadsheet and make a call and walk into a conference room in a grey jacket and receive what was fair without asking for more than that. That is enough. It has always been enough. I just needed the bottom to show me. That is my story. 4 years, 18 months of something I was not supposed to know, 32,160 from a joint account, and a folder thick enough to change the ending. If there is an account in your life that someone else manages and that you have not looked at in longer than you can remember, this week is the week. Not because you are suspicious. Because it is yours. Because the numbers in your life deserve your attention as much as any other part of it, and a woman who knows her own financial picture is a woman nobody can quietly drain while she is busy keeping everything else together. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Signed in Silence, because the next story is already waiting and the woman in it is about to find something that was hidden in plain sight. Drop a comment and tell me where you are watching from. I will see you in the next one.